I should have known something was wrong when Julia started buying expensive lingerie for her yoga classes. But like most husbands, I figured ignorance was bliss until I found that damn receipt crumpled in her purse at midnight. My name's Jack Morrison, and I fix cars for a living in this dying mill town called Millbrook. Used to be a thriving place where honest folks made decent money building furniture and textiles. Now it's just another forgotten spot on the map where gossip travels faster than bad news, and everyone knows everyone else's business, except apparently your own wife's. The receipt was from some adult store downtown. Handcuffs, flavored lubricant, and something called a pleasure enhancer. The total was $87. Julia had never spent $87 on anything for our bedroom in 15 years of marriage. I sat there in my cluttered workshop behind our house, oil-stained hands holding that piece of paper like it was a death certificate. The fluorescent light buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows on my workbench covered with wrenches, spark plugs, and half-finished projects. This was my sanctuary, the place where I could think clearly while my hands stayed busy fixing things that actually could be fixed. The smart play would have been to confront her right then, march into the house, wake her up, and demand answers. But I've learned that the direct approach usually gets you nowhere except divorced and broke. So instead, I did what any self-respecting mechanic would do. I planned some creative sabotage. The next morning, Julia was all smiles and coffee, wearing that new silk blouse that probably cost more than I make in a day. "Good morning, honey," she chirped, not meeting my eyes. "I've got that late client meeting tonight, so don't wait up." "Sure thing," I replied, stirring sugar into my coffee. "Which client?" A tiny hesitation. "The Henderson Project." You know, the new office complex downtown. I knew for a fact the Henderson Project had been completed 3 weeks ago, but I just nodded and watched her grab her purse, the same purse where I'd carefully placed that receipt back exactly where I'd found it. After she left in her silver BMW, another recent purchase she'd explained as necessary for client meetings, I got to work. If Julia wanted to play games with expensive toys, I figured I'd help her out. I drove to that same adult store, walked in like I belonged there, and bought an identical bottle of that flavored lubricant. Then I went home and replaced the contents with industrial-strength superglue. Call it petty, call it juvenile. But when you've been married to someone for 15 years and they're suddenly buying sex toys for someone else, petty feels pretty damn satisfying. The real confirmation came 2 days later when I followed her silver BMW to the Sleepy Inn Motel on Route 9. Not exactly the kind of place you'd take a client unless your business involved hourly rates. I parked across the street and watched her knock on room 237. The door opened, and out stepped Derek Hoffman, her colleague from the architecture firm, all 6 feet of gym rat perfection with his designer haircut and $1,000 suit. They disappeared inside, and I waited. About an hour later, I heard shouting, then more shouting, then what sounded like someone trying to break down a bathroom door. I couldn't help but grin as I imagined them discovering my little modification to their romantic supplies. I left a note under the windshield wiper of Derek's red Mustang. "Hope you two are really stuck on each other now?" A concerned citizen. That should have been enough. A little humiliation, a lesson learned, maybe even a wake-up call for Julia to remember what she had at home. But life in a small town doesn't work that way. By the next morning, half of Millbrook had heard about the incident at the Sleepy Inn. Mrs. Kent, our 70-year-old neighbor who could spot scandal from 3 blocks away, cornered me at the hardware store. "Jack Morrison, I heard the most interesting story about your wife and that pretty boy from her office," she whispered, loud enough for everyone in the store to hear. "Something about them getting themselves into quite the sticky situation, if you catch my meaning." I caught her meaning, all right. I also caught the smirks from the other customers and the way conversations stopped when I walked by. In a town this size, being the cuckolded husband was like wearing a scarlet letter, except the letter was L for loser. That night, Julia came home 3 hours late, walking funny and avoiding eye contact. "How was your client meeting?" I asked innocently. "Fine," she snapped. Just fine. But it wasn't fine. Not for her, not for Derek, and definitely not for me. Because our 15-year-old daughter Maddie had started asking questions about why Mom was walking weird and why people at school were whispering about our family. And when I tried to explain that sometimes adults make mistakes, Maddie looked at me with those accusing teenage eyes and said, "Maybe if you paid more attention to Mom instead of those stupid cars, she wouldn't have to find someone who appreciates her." That's when I realized this wasn't just about Julia's affair. This was about my entire family choosing sides, and I was losing. If there's one thing I've learned from fixing engines, it's that when something's broken, you don't just patch it up and hope for the best. You strip it down, figure out exactly what went wrong, and rebuild it properly. My marriage was clearly beyond repair, but my reputation in this town still had some salvageable parts. I started with reconnaissance. Every small town has its information networks, and Millbrook was no different. The key was knowing which channels to use and which people to trust. My best friend Ray Patterson ran Murphy's Tavern, the kind of dive bar where locals went to complain about their lives and share gossip. Ray was an ex-cop who'd retired early after a back injury, and he had the kind of cynical wisdom that comes from seeing too much human stupidity. "You want my advice?" Ray said, wiping down glasses behind the bar while I nursed my third beer. "Don't get mad. Get even, but get smart about it first." "What do you mean?" "I mean your wife and her boy toy think they're dealing with some dumb grease monkey who's gonna roll over and take it. Show them they're wrong, but do it right. Make them destroy themselves." Ray had a point. Direct confrontation would just make me look like the jealous husband everyone expected me to be. But if I could manipulate the situation so that Julia and Derek's own actions exposed them, that was different. That was justice. The first step was gathering intelligence. I knew Julia's schedule better than she thought I did, and I knew Derek's too after a little casual observation. Every Tuesday and Thursday, they met at different motels around the county. Always cheap places, always paid in cash, always thinking they were being clever. What they didn't know was that Derek's precious Mustang had a few mechanical issues developing. Nothing dangerous. I'm not a psychopath. But sugar in the gas tank creates some interesting engine problems, and loosening a few non-essential bolts can make a car sound like it's falling apart. Every time Derek tried to impress Julia with his smooth ride, the engine would cough and sputter like a dying animal. The psychological warfare was more subtle. I started leaving little hints around town that Derek might not be as successful as he pretended. A casual mention to the bank teller that I'd heard he was having financial troubles. A comment to the grocery store clerk about seeing him at the unemployment office. Nothing actionable, nothing that could be traced back to me, but enough to plant seeds of doubt. The beauty of small-town gossip is that it grows exponentially. Mrs. Kent heard about Derek's supposed money problems and immediately shared the news with her bridge club. Within a week, half the town was convinced that Derek was broke and probably using Julia for her connections and money. But the real masterstroke came when I discovered Derek's weakness, his ego. The man couldn't resist showing off, especially in front of other people. So, when the annual Millbrook High School fundraiser came around, a community event where everyone gathered in the gymnasium to bid on donated items and pretend they cared about education, I made sure to attend. Julia was there with Derek, trying to play it off as a professional relationship. "Derek was kind enough to escort me since Jack had to work late," she announced to anyone who would listen. Of course, I wasn't working late. I was standing right behind them, having arrived just in time to hear that particular lie. "Actually, honey," I said loudly enough for the surrounding crowd to hear, "I finished early. Figured I'd come support our daughter's school. Hope you don't mind if I join you." The look on Derek's face was priceless. Pure panic mixed with that particular brand of guilt that comes from being caught red-handed. Julia recovered faster, but I could see the wheels turning behind her eyes as she tried to figure out how to handle this situation. "Of course not," she said through gritted teeth. Derek was just telling me about the new project his firm is working on. Really? What kind of project? I asked Derek directly, extending my hand for a handshake. I don't think we've been properly introduced. Jack Morrison, Julia's husband. Derek's handshake was weak and sweaty. Derek Hoffman. Nice to meet you. Oh, we've actually met before, I said with a smile. At the Sleepy Inn parking lot last week. You were having some car trouble, remember? The color drained from Derek's face. Julia's eyes went wide, and the small crowd around us suddenly got very quiet, sensing drama in the air like sharks smelling blood. I don't remember, Derek stammered. Sure you do. Red Mustang, engine problems. You and Julia were discussing architectural solutions. I left you a note about getting unstuck from difficult situations. That's when Derek made his fatal mistake. Instead of playing it cool or changing the subject, he got defensive. Look, I don't know what you're implying, but I'm not implying anything, I interrupted. I'm just making conversation. Though I have to say, you might want to get that car looked at. Sounded like it was having some serious performance issues. The double entendre wasn't lost on anyone in earshot. A few people actually snickered. Derek's face went from pale to bright red, and Julia looked like she wanted to disappear into the floor. But the evening's entertainment was just getting started. During the auction, Derek decided to prove his worth by bidding aggressively on expensive items: a weekend getaway package, a signed sports memorabilia collection, dinner for two at the county's fanciest restaurant. Each time he raised his paddle, I could see Julia getting more uncomfortable. She knew something the rest of us were pretending not to know. Derek couldn't afford any of this. When the auctioneer called for payment, Derek's credit card was declined. Twice. The silence in that gymnasium was deafening as 300 people watched this supposedly successful architect fumble through his wallet, trying to find another card that might work. I can cover it, Julia whispered, but her voice carried in the dead quiet. No need, I announced, standing up. I'll take care of Derek's purchases. Consider it a neighborly gesture. The humiliation on Derek's face was complete. Not only had he been exposed as financially unstable, but he'd been rescued by the husband of the woman he was sleeping with. In front of the entire town. It was beautiful. But Julia wasn't done fighting. As we walked to the parking lot afterward, she grabbed my arm and hissed, "What the hell do you think you're doing?" "Helping out a friend in need," I replied innocently. "Isn't that what good Christians do?" "You're making a fool of yourself, Jack. And you're embarrassing our daughter." I looked around the parking lot until I spotted Maddie talking with her friends by the school entrance. She was laughing about something, completely oblivious to the drama unfolding between her parents. "Looks like she's doing fine," I said. "But you're right about one thing. Someone is making a fool of themselves. Question is, who? The thing about revenge is that it's addictive. Each small victory makes you hungry for a bigger one, and before you know it, you're planning elaborate schemes that would make a soap opera writer proud." But I was still thinking like a mechanic, methodical, precise, and always thinking 3 steps ahead. Julia's behavior changed after the school fundraiser incident. She became more secretive, more defensive, and started spending even more time away from home. She also started bringing her best friend Samantha around more often, like she needed backup or moral support. Samantha Reed was one of those perfectly put-together suburban women who drove a white SUV, organized charity events, and had opinions about everything. She'd been Julia's friend since college, and I'd never particularly liked her, though I couldn't put my finger on why. "Jack's been acting so strange lately," I overheard Julia telling Samantha in our kitchen one evening. "I think he might be having some kind of breakdown. Men his age often struggle with feelings of inadequacy," Samantha replied in that psychology textbook tone she loved to use. "Maybe he should talk to someone professional." I was in the next room, supposedly watching television, but actually listening to every word. The irony was thick enough to cut with a knife. My wife was discussing my mental health with her friend while planning her next rendezvous with her lover. But Samantha's comment gave me an idea. If Julia wanted to paint me as unstable, I could work with that. Crazy like a fox, as my grandfather used to say. The next phase of my campaign required more sophisticated tools than sugar and superglue. Fortunately, Ray's background in law enforcement had given him some interesting skills and contacts. Over beers at Murphy's Tavern, he introduced me to a guy named Tommy who ran a small electronics shop and had a side business in security consulting. "What exactly are you looking for?" Tommy asked, setting down his beer and leaning forward, conspiratorially. "Information," I said. "My wife's been acting suspicious, and I want to know what she's really up to." Tommy nodded knowingly. "GPS tracking device for her car. Small magnetic battery, lasts about 6 months. Completely legal as long as the vehicle is registered in your name, too." It was. Julia and I had bought the BMW together 3 years ago, both names on the title. Technically, I had every right to know where my own car was going. The GPS tracker revealed patterns I hadn't noticed before. Julia wasn't just meeting Derek at motels. They were also spending time at his house, a modern glass and steel monstrosity in Millbrook's newest development, Sunset Ridge. More importantly, Samantha was often there too, her white SUV parked in Derek's driveway at the same times as Julia's BMW. That was interesting. Either Samantha was providing cover for the affair, or something else was going on. I decided to find out which. The opportunity came during Millbrook's annual Founders' Day celebration, a weekend festival where the whole town gathered in the Central Park for food, music, and the kind of forced community spirit that small towns specialize in. Julia had volunteered to help with the planning committee, which meant she'd be busy all day Saturday setting up booths and coordinating volunteers. I told her I was spending the day working on a transmission job that couldn't wait, then drove to Derek's neighborhood and parked where I could watch his house. Sure enough, around noon, Samantha's SUV pulled into his driveway. About an hour later, Derek's Mustang arrived. Apparently he'd gotten it fixed, though it still sounded rough thanks to my ongoing mechanical interventions. What happened next surprised me. Instead of the romantic rendezvous I expected, I watched through binoculars as Derek, Samantha, and a third person I didn't recognize sat around Derek's dining room table with papers spread out in front of them. It looked like a business meeting, not a lover's tryst. I needed to get closer. Derek's house backed up to a small wooded area, and the trees provided decent cover for someone willing to do a little trespassing. I parked a few blocks away and made my way through the woods, feeling like a teenager sneaking out past curfew. The dining room windows were large and faced the backyard, giving me a clear view of the meeting inside. Derek was showing documents to Samantha and the third person, who I now recognized as Marcus Webb, a lawyer who specialized in real estate and divorce cases. This was definitely not about architecture or charity work. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but I could see enough to understand the general situation. Marcus was pointing to specific sections of documents, Samantha was taking notes, and Derek was nodding along like an eager student. When Samantha pulled out a manila folder and handed it to Marcus, I caught a glimpse of the label. Morrison, Jack, and Julia. Property assessment. My blood went cold. They were planning to take my house. I stayed hidden in the woods for another hour, watching and taking pictures with my phone. The meeting broke up around 3 o'clock, with handshakes all around and satisfied smiles. After they left, I made my way back to my truck and drove home, mind racing with implications. Julia was already home when I arrived, cheerfully asking about my day and how the transmission job had gone. I played along, describing fictional problems with fictional car parts while studying her face for any sign of guilt or deception. She was good. I had to give her credit for that. If I hadn't seen that meeting with my own eyes, I might have believed her innocent act. But now I knew this wasn't just about an affair. This was about a coordinated effort to destroy my life, take my property, and leave me with nothing. The affair with Derek was just one part of a larger plan, and Samantha was clearly the mastermind behind it all. That night, after Julia went to bed, I sat in my workshop and tried to piece together the full scope of what I was dealing with. Samantha had always been ambitious and manipulative, but I'd never imagined she was capable of something this elaborate. The question was why? What had I ever done to her that would justify this level of revenge? The answer came to me around 2 a.m, along with a memory I'd tried to forget. 3 years ago, Samantha's husband Rick had been caught embezzling money from the construction company where he worked as an accountant. The company had hired me to examine some equipment that Rick had supposedly purchased for business use, but had actually bought for his personal garage. My testimony had helped prove that Rick was using company funds for personal expenses, and he'd ended up serving 18 months in prison. Samantha had never forgiven me for that, even though I'd just told the truth about what I'd found. She'd blamed me for destroying her family's reputation and causing Rick's imprisonment. At the time, I'd thought she was just upset and would get over it eventually. Apparently, I'd been wrong. Now she was orchestrating an elaborate scheme to return the favor, destroy my marriage, take my property, and leave me as broken as she felt I'd left her family. The affair between Julia and Derek wasn't about love or passion. It was about creating grounds for divorce and making me look like the unstable, neglectful husband who deserved to lose everything. But understanding your enemy's motivation is the first step toward defeating them. And now that I knew what I was really fighting, I could start planning a proper counterattack. The gloves were coming off. They say revenge is a dish best served cold, but I was finding that righteous anger burns pretty hot when you discover your wife and her best friend are plotting to steal your house. The meeting I'd witnessed at Derek's place had changed everything. This wasn't just about a cheating wife anymore. This was about a coordinated attack on my entire life. I needed proof. Real, actionable evidence that would hold up in court and expose the whole conspiracy. Fortunately, Tommy the electronics guy had more tricks up his sleeve than just GPS trackers. "What you need is a good old-fashioned bug," he explained over coffee at the diner on Monday morning. "Voice-activated, long battery life, and small enough to hide anywhere. Completely illegal if you put it in someone else's property, but perfectly fine in your own house." He was right. Julia might be planning to take my house, but for now, it was still legally mine. And if she wanted to have private conversations with her co-conspirators in my living room, I had every right to know what they were saying. The device Tommy gave me was smaller than a matchbox and could record up to 40 hours of conversation. I placed it inside the fake plant Julia kept on the mantelpiece. The same plant I'd been making fun of for years because it looked so obviously artificial. Sometimes irony has a sense of humor. I didn't have to wait long. That Wednesday evening, Samantha came over for what Julia described as a girls' night to plan some charity event. I made myself scarce, telling them I was going to Murphy's Tavern to watch the game with Ray. Instead, I parked around the corner and waited. Around 9 o'clock, Derek's Mustang pulled into my driveway. So much for girls' night. I gave them 30 minutes to get comfortable, then snuck back to my own house and listened through the kitchen window. What I heard made my blood boil. "Jack's been more suspicious lately," Julia was saying. "I think he might know something." "Doesn't matter," Samantha replied. "Marcus says we have enough documentation to prove emotional abuse and financial irresponsibility. Between Derek's testimony about Jack's threatening behavior at the school event and the evidence of his unstable mental state, we should be able to get a restraining order and temporary custody of Maddie." "What about the house?" Derek asked. "That's the beautiful part," Samantha continued. "Julia gets the house as part of the settlement, sells it to pay for Maddie's college and her own fresh start, and Jack gets stuck with the mortgage payments on a property he can't even visit. Meanwhile, you and Julia can start over somewhere new with a nice nest egg." They were laughing, actually laughing about destroying my life and taking my daughter away from me. I had to grip the windowsill to keep from charging inside and confronting them right then and there. But Ray's advice echoed in my head. Get smart about it. Make them destroy themselves. I went back to my truck and waited until Derek left around 11. Then I retrieved the recording device and spent the rest of the night listening to their entire conversation. By morning, I had a complete picture of their plan, including timelines, legal strategies, and financial arrangements. More importantly, I had recorded proof of conspiracy to commit fraud. The next step was insurance. I made copies of everything: the recordings, the photos from Derek's house, the GPS tracking data showing Julia's movements, and documentation of all the suspicious financial transactions I'd discovered in our joint accounts. One copy went to a safety deposit box at the bank, another to Ray for safekeeping, and a third to an envelope addressed to Marcus Webb with instructions to open it if anything happened to me. Then I started setting traps. The first trap was financial. Julia had been slowly moving money out of our joint accounts into a private account she thought I didn't know about, but two can play that game. I opened my own private account and began transferring money from our shared business account, money that was legally mine since I'd earned it through my repair shop. If Julia wanted to play financial games, she'd discover that mechanics understand numbers just fine. The second trap was social. I started being more visible around town, making sure people saw me acting normal, stable, and responsible. I volunteered to help with the church's car maintenance, donated time to fix vehicles for elderly neighbors, and generally made myself look like the kind of upstanding citizen who definitely wasn't an abusive husband. Meanwhile, I began subtly undermining Derek's reputation. A casual comment here, a strategic question there, nothing that could be traced back to me, but enough to plant seeds of doubt. I mentioned to the bank president that I'd heard Derek was having financial troubles. I told the mayor's wife that someone had seen Derek's car at the Sleepy Inn during business hours. I suggested to the local newspaper editor that maybe they should look into the city contracts Derek's firm had been winning lately. The beauty of small-town gossip is that once you start the ball rolling, it gains momentum on its own. Within 2 weeks, Derek was facing questions about his professional ethics, his financial stability, and his personal conduct. The city council announced they were reviewing all contracts with his firm, and several clients began asking uncomfortable questions about billing practices. But the real masterstroke came when I discovered Samantha's weakness, her own husband, Rick. Rick had been released from prison 6 months earlier and was trying to rebuild his life and reputation. He'd found work as a bookkeeper for a small accounting firm and was slowly regaining the trust of the community. What he didn't know was that his wife was orchestrating another elaborate scheme that could destroy his second chance at a normal life. I arranged to run into Rick at the grocery store on a Saturday morning, making it look like a casual encounter between old acquaintances. "Rick, good to see you, man. How are you settling back in?" He looked uncomfortable but tried to be polite. "Doing okay, Jack." "Thanks for asking. I'm glad to hear it. I know things were tough for a while there, but it takes a real man to own up to his mistakes and start over. I respect that." Rick's expression softened slightly. Whatever he'd expected from me, it wasn't understanding or encouragement. "Listen," I continued, "I hope there are no hard feelings about that whole business with the construction company. I was just doing my job, you know? Nothing personal." "I know," Rick said quietly. "I made my own choices. Can't blame anyone else for the consequences. That's a mature attitude. I wish more people thought that way." I paused, then added casually, "Speaking of which, how's Samantha handling everything? This whole situation must have been hard on her too." Rick's face darkened slightly. "She's dealing with it, in her own way." "Well, if there's anything I can do to help you folks get back on your feet, just let me know. We're neighbors, after all." I could see Rick processing this unexpected olive branch. He was clearly a man who'd learned some hard lessons about loyalty and consequences. More importantly, he was someone who might be very interested to know what his wife was really up to these days. I didn't push it. Seeds planted. Message delivered. If Rick was half as smart as I thought he was, he'd start paying closer attention to Samantha's activities. And when he discovered her involvement in a scheme to defraud another family out of their home and assets, He'd have to decide whether to protect his wife or protect the new life he was trying to build. By the end of that week, all the pieces were in place. Julia, Derek, and Samantha thought they were closing in on their victory, but they were actually walking into a carefully constructed trap. The only question was which one of them would trigger the mechanism that brought the whole conspiracy crashing down. I didn't have to wait long to find out. The trap sprung on a Tuesday morning, exactly 3 weeks after I'd discovered their meeting at Derek's house. Rick Reed walked into Murphy's Tavern at 10:30, looking like a man who'd been wrestling with his conscience and finally let it win. "We need to talk," he said, sliding into the booth across from me. Ray, who'd been expecting this conversation ever since I'd told him about my encounter with Rick at the grocery store, set down 2 cups of coffee and made himself scarce. Smart man. "I found some interesting documents in Samantha's home office," Rick continued without preamble. "Legal papers with your name on them, financial records, photos of your house and property assessments." "That is interesting," I replied, keeping my voice neutral. Rick leaned forward, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Jack, I did 18 months in prison for financial fraud. You think I don't recognize a con when I see one? My wife is planning to destroy you the same way I got destroyed, except she's doing it on purpose. Why are you telling me this? Because I'm tired of being married to someone who thinks revenge is more important than building an honest life." Rick's hands were shaking slightly as he reached into his jacket pocket. "And because you were right when you testified against me. I was stealing and I deserved to get caught, but you don't deserve what she's planning." He slid a manila envelope across the table. "Copies of everything I found. Financial records, legal documents, email printouts, the whole conspiracy. There's enough evidence there to send all 3 of them to prison for fraud and conspiracy." I opened the envelope and quickly scanned the contents. It was even worse than I'd imagined. Forged documents claiming I'd been physically abusive. Fake medical records suggesting Julia had been treated for injuries I'd supposedly inflicted. Financial records showing money being moved around to make me look like I was hiding assets. "Jesus Christ," I muttered. "They were really going to destroy me." "They were going to destroy both of us," Rick corrected. "You think Samantha was planning to keep me around after she pulled this off?" I was going to be the next casualty, probably framed for helping with the fraud. "She's been planning this for 3 years, Jack. Ever since I got arrested." The pieces finally clicked into place. Samantha hadn't just been angry about Rick's imprisonment, she'd been planning her revenge ever since. The affair between Julia and Derek was just a tool, a way to create the circumstances she needed to frame me for abuse and steal my property. Julia and Derek thought they were the masterminds, but they were just pawns in Samantha's larger game. "What do you want to do about it?" I asked. "I want to stop her before she destroys anyone else. And I want my life back from someone who's been using me as cover for her criminal activities." We spent the next hour planning our counterattack. Rick knew Samantha's schedule, her methods, and her weaknesses. I had recordings, photos, and financial evidence. Together, we had enough ammunition to not only stop their conspiracy, but to turn it back on them in spectacular fashion. The final confrontation was set for Friday evening, during the town's monthly community meeting in the high school gymnasium. It was perfect, a public venue where the entire town would witness the exposure of the conspiracy. Julia, Derek, and Samantha would be there, expecting to continue their charade. Instead, they'd find themselves facing justice. Friday evening arrived with unseasonably warm weather and clear skies. The gymnasium was packed with nearly 400 residents, all gathered to discuss mundane town business like road repairs and budget allocations. Julia sat in the 3rd row with Samantha, both of them looking confident and relaxed. Derek was near the back, probably trying to avoid drawing attention to himself, given his recent professional troubles. I waited until the meeting reached the open comment period, then stood up and asked to address the community. "Thank you, Mayor Patterson," I began, walking to the front of the room. "I want to talk tonight about fraud, conspiracy, and what happens when people think they're smarter than everyone else. I could see Julia's face go pale, but she was trapped in her seat with hundreds of people watching. Samantha looked confused, like she wasn't sure what was happening but knew it wasn't good. 3 weeks ago, I discovered that my wife was having an affair with Derek Hoffman from the architecture firm. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. But that's not why I'm here tonight. I'm here because the affair was just part of a larger conspiracy to commit fraud and steal my property. I pulled out the first piece of evidence, a blown-up photo of the meeting at Derek's house. This photo shows Derek Hoffman, Samantha Reed, and lawyer Marcus Webb planning to use forged documents and false testimony to frame me for domestic abuse and steal my house. The murmurs turned to gasps. Several people were already pulling out their phones to record what was clearly becoming the most dramatic town meeting in Millbrook's history. But the real mastermind behind this conspiracy is Samantha Reed, who's been planning this revenge scheme for 3 years because I testified truthfully about her husband's embezzlement case. Samantha finally found her voice. "This is ridiculous." Jack's obviously having some kind of breakdown. "Actually," Rick interrupted, standing up from his seat in the middle of the gymnasium, "my wife is the one having a breakdown. A criminal breakdown." The look of shock and betrayal on Samantha's face was worth every sleepless night I'd spent planning this moment. She'd never expected her own husband to turn against her. Rick walked to the front of the room and stood next to me. "Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Rick Reed, and I'm here to confess that my wife has been using our home as headquarters for a criminal conspiracy. I have evidence of forged documents, financial fraud, and conspiracy to commit perjury." I played the recording from my living room, the one where Julia, Derek, and Samantha discussed their plan in detail. 400 people listened in stunned silence as they heard the 3 conspirators laughing about destroying my life and stealing my property. When the recording ended, the gymnasium was dead quiet, except for the sound of Julia crying and Derek trying to sneak toward the exit. But Ray Patterson, the mayor's son and a current police officer, was already blocking the doors. "Derek Hoffman," Ray announced in his official police voice, "you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud." The next few minutes were chaos. Derek was handcuffed and led away while protesting his innocence. Samantha was screaming at Rick, calling him a traitor and threatening to destroy him. Julia was sobbing and trying to explain to our daughter Maddie, who had been sitting with her friends and was now staring at her mother in horror and disbelief. But I wasn't done yet. "There's one more thing," I announced, waiting for the crowd to quiet down. "I want everyone in this town to understand exactly what these 3 people were willing to do for money and revenge." I held up the forged medical records. These documents claim that Julia Morrison was treated for injuries I supposedly inflicted on her. They're completely fabricated. But if their plan had worked, I would have been arrested, lost my home, lost custody of my daughter, and probably spent years in prison for crimes I never committed. I looked directly at Julia, who was still crying in her seat. 15 years of marriage, and you were willing to send me to prison for something I never did. For money and revenge that wasn't even your idea. Finally, I turned to address the whole crowd. I want everyone here to remember this night. Remember what happens when people think they can lie, cheat, and steal without consequences. Remember that the truth always comes out eventually, and justice might be slow, but it's thorough. The crowd erupted in applause. Not polite, obligatory applause, but genuine appreciation for seeing justice served and truth revealed. In a small town where everyone knows everyone else's business, there's nothing more satisfying than watching the guilty get exactly what they deserve. Julia and Samantha were arrested that night. Derek was already in custody. Marcus Webb, the lawyer, was arrested the next morning when police searched his office and found evidence of his involvement in the document forgery. All 4 of them were charged with conspiracy to commit fraud, perjury, and attempted theft. The trials took 8 months. All 4 defendants were convicted and sentenced to prison terms ranging from 2 to 5 years. Julia lost her job, her reputation, and her freedom. Derek's architecture firm collapsed, and he filed for bankruptcy before reporting to prison. Samantha got the longest sentence because she was identified as the ringleader, and she lost her house to pay legal fees and restitution. Marcus Webb was disbarred and sentenced to 3 years in federal prison. Rick Reed divorced Samantha while she was awaiting trial and moved to another state to start over again. Before he left, he stopped by my shop to thank me for giving him the chance to do the right thing. "I owe you one, Jack," he said, shaking my hand. "You could have destroyed me along with the rest of them, but you gave me a choice instead." "Everyone deserves a second chance," I replied. "You earned yours." My daughter Maddie took the whole situation hard at first, but eventually she came to understand that I'd been protecting our family from people who wanted to destroy us. She moved back in with me full-time and started helping out at the repair shop after school. We're closer now than we've ever been. The house is quiet these days, but it's a good quiet. The kind of peace that comes from knowing the truth has been told and justice has been served. I still work on cars, still live in the same house, still drink coffee at Murphy's Tavern with Ray. But now when I walk through town, people nod with respect instead of pity. Sometimes the good guys win. Sometimes the truth is enough. And sometimes the best revenge is simply letting your enemies destroy themselves with their own greed and stupidity. Justice served cold, with a side of poetic irony.